May I have everyone's attention? If everyone would try and find a seat as soon as possible, we are getting ready to start our program. My name is Karen Kaplan, and I will be moderating this evening's UTHealth House Calls. I wish I could tell you my name was Oprah so that I could say, and you get a car, and you get a car, and you get a car. But unfortunately, all I brought was fantastic medical science innovations and development. As most of you know, UT Health House Calls events are streaming live on abc13.com as well as YouTube, Facebook Live, and that is why we have the big looming camera. We also have the wonderful Andrew Hager here from UT Health, who will also be walking around taking photos. And though it is unlikely you would be captured on camera, if for any reason in the middle of this talk you have the overwhelming desire to jump from your chair and run over and grab a seat inside of a, I don't know, Mercedes 2020 AMG candy red convertible, not that I know anything about cars, please try to sit in the back or off to the side so that you are not caught in the act of being your bad self while the camera's rolling. So, since the cameras are rolling, we gratefully ask that your own questions, those of you in the live audience, be held and asked of Dr. Savitz once the event is over. Dr. Savitz would be more than happy to stay and answer whatever questions you have. That is the perk of being a live audience. You have a real live house call, up close and personal. So, we look forward to that you will have a wonderful time and enjoy this broadcast. In just a moment, we'll be going live, so thank you all, and I hope you enjoy the program.
Okay. Hello and welcome to UT House Calls presented by Mercedes-Benz Dealers of Greater Houston. My name is Joe Drago. I'm the general manager here at Mercedes-Benz of the Woodlands. We are proud to partner with UT Health to bring awareness to important health issues and the incredible work done by clinicians, professors, and researchers at the university. And thanks to this partnership, I'm also pleased to announce that Mercedes-Benz of the Woodlands is once again giving two $5,000 scholarships to UT Health, this time benefiting their graduate school, the MD Anderson UT Health Graduate School of Biomedical Sciences. And now let me turn the evening over to our moderator, Karen Kaplan, a medical journalist and longtime member of UT Health.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you, Joe, and thank you again to Mercedes-Benz of the Woodlands for hosting tonight's event. I have the pleasure of serving as moderator, as Joe said, for the UT Health House Call series, which is a wonderful way to bring awareness to important health topics. And thanks to abc13.com, an equally wonderful way to bring you the answers to some of the questions you may have about your health. And now, the reason you are all tuning in this evening, tonight's topic is the future of stem cell therapy for stroke and other brain injuries. With us this evening is Dr. Sean Savitz, internationally recognized as a leader in the advancement of stroke care and research, including the field of stem cell therapy. Dr. Savitz is a professor of neurology, a practicing physician at UT Physicians and Memorial Hermann, and the director of the Institute for Stroke and Cerebrovascular Diseases at McGovern Medical School at UT Health. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Dr. Sean Savitz.
Thank you, Karen. Really, oh, I'm moving over to this one. Okay. Really thank Karen, and really just thank everybody for coming tonight, and really appreciate this. I mean, people coming to hear about this really amazing area of science and medicine, that is continuing to make strides in many different ways that we're going to talk about tonight. It's a field which many, I guess, would call regenerative medicine. You know, I suppose people would, you know, ask, you know, what exactly is regenerative medicine? So, you know, I go to Google and I go to Wikipedia because that's like the definitive source of all information these days. And you know, you can see what's the definitions behind it. But you know, it's a field in which we actually have learned that rather than using medications and drugs, that cells that come from the human body also possess therapeutic potential to treat a whole host of different disorders and diseases. And I'm mainly going to speak about stroke and other brain disorders and other neurological disorders like neurodegenerative disease. But you know, it extends in thinking about overall the possibilities are really breathtaking. When we think about the use of cells, there are many different cells within the body. Some of them are stem cells. Some of them are not. They're actually mature cells that have been found to exert therapeutic activity either in the laboratory, in animal models, in studies that involve kind of petri dishes, in vitro work. But there's something about the cells that exert an effect that's beneficial, and that's really what the definition is of a cell-based therapy. And many people are thinking about the use of stem cells for the idea of regrowing new tissues that may have been injured or lost or damaged within the body is a kind of a transplantation approach. But there's another way that's evolved as well in thinking about the use of cells, which is that many different types of stem cells and cell-based therapies actually release biological factors that help the body or the brain to be able to heal itself. And that's actually, that second definition is what I'm going to be focusing on in this talk right now, because that's where we see some of the greatest strides right now for its application for patients with neurological disorders, and specifically in stroke. So the idea that we've learned over the past 10 to 15 years is that there are certain cells within the body, particularly ones that are within the bone marrow, but other tissues as well, like the umbilical cord, placental tissues, you know, and others. Certain cells within those tissues can release different types of proteins and different growth factors. And those products, those factors themselves, are what's actually responsible for the treatment effects. And so this is a very different concept, not the one that we were thinking about when we started actually thinking about the application of cell-based therapies for, let's say, people with stroke. Overall, quite honestly, when I was thinking about it, and many of us in the field were thinking about it 10 to 15 years ago, the idea was that, well, maybe if we have stem cells in our bone marrow, perhaps they could actually turn into a new brain cell. And that would be a new neuron that could regrow the brain. An amazing, you know, idea to think about, but that's actually not what's happening. And we've learned through several different studies that indeed that really isn't the case. And so what we have a much better understanding is that when certain types of stem cells are injected either in animal models or in patients overall, what we find is that those cells themselves, they may go to the area of injury or they may not, but still they're releasing very selectively these biological proteins and other types of biological factors. Even there's pieces of the stem cells that are membrane bound called microvesicles, and some of you may have heard them called exosomes, that actually are released into the blood circulation. Some of them can get in the brain and completely re-engineer and change what's going on within the area of the injury. So we can imagine that for things that we have learned about, an injection even intravenously of certain types of stem cells can then lead to the release of various different biological factors. They themselves are what's telling the brain to actually heal. And a big thing that we've learned about this is that if we have injury within our brain, whether that's due to a stroke or a traumatic brain injury, even neurodegenerative disorders, we all know that what happens when we hit ourselves and we get some damage to our body, we get inflammation. If I were to hit my arm, or if I bang my arm against something, what happens? It turns red, it swells up, exactly. And that's it, that's inflammation. Unfortunately, when we've had a stroke, traumatic brain injury, or other types of injuries, inflammation also occurs as well. And for the most part, that type of inflammation is very damaging. It's very detrimental. And what we've learned is that many types of stem cells are exquisitely sensitive to change the inflammatory response. And this is a big part of what we've understood now about the mechanisms of how stem cells and other cell-based therapies may work. And because of that understanding, we have been working at UTHealth, and specifically in the Institute for Stroke and Cerebrovascular Disease, around the idea that we could apply stem cells in those early periods after a brain injury to reduce and modify the inflammatory response after a stroke or other type of injury. And our work has gone from animal models and laboratory studies all the way up into clinical trials, where we're getting to the point in which we're going to know not only do we find these approaches to be safe, but do they really work to actually help people improve their outcome, bring back more of their quality of life, to our patients, reduce their overall disability. So that has been a 10-year journey. And as many of you know from the research and development world, it takes that long and even longer to be able to bring new therapies to patients, to actually take something that starts off in the preclinical laboratory stage, bring it all the way up to the point where it might actually get approved as a therapy for the FDA, tends to be in that 10 to 15-year range. So we're very fortunate at UTHealth because we've been in the cutting edge of these approaches, and it's now been 10 years. And so we're reaching that point where we're now going to know from some clinical trials, do they really work for our patients with stroke and traumatic brain injury? And our focus has been on the first few days after the onset of injury, because we think and have always thought that, well, there's probably a golden window, and that may be it, that inflammatory response which starts and evolves over time, that's going to be the target. If we can change the inflammation, the brain is then able to engage in more recovery. Because what we've learned about cell-based therapies is that if you can change the inflammatory response, you can also then be able to stimulate the generation of new neurons and new blood vessels within an injured brain. I just want to be clear that I'm not saying that a bone marrow cell becomes a neuron. I'm saying that the bone marrow cells are able to tell the brain to make new neurons, to make new blood vessels, to actually reduce the scarring that occurs within the injured brain. The approaches that you may have heard about with regards to cell-based therapies, there's multiple different ones. There are cell-based therapies that people are manufacturing that come from the individual. We call that autologous. And in that kind of approach, many people harbor their own stem cells from various different tissues of our body, bone marrow being one of them. But of course, adipose tissue, you may have heard a lot about, fat-derived stem cells. So that's of course another one. And it's now even possible for patients, unfortunately for our infants and children who, God forbid, they develop a problem or a medical problem, if their umbilical cord was stored, that's another autologous application that can actually be used and is actually being studied, for many children that have a medical disorder. And in my world, we're talking about patients that have cerebral palsy, who have had injuries from other types of brain injuries, such as many people have heard of HIE, hypoxic ischemic encephalopathy, and so forth. So that's one approach, and many people have heard about. That's how we started our work in 2007, 2008. We were actually the first center to get NIH funding to study an approach where we were taking stroke patients' own bone marrow cells. We would purify out a particular fraction of that bone marrow, and then we were giving it back to the patients intravenously within the first 3 days of the onset of their stroke. And so we found that approach to be safe. But there's been a whole revolution over the past 10 years in our thought process and our opportunities. It's now possible that you can grow stem cells from the bone marrow of a healthy volunteer. And in this process, what we're talking about is a small aspiration of some bone marrow from someone who's healthy, and then we can purify out the stem cells and grow them in cell culture to very large quantities. These cells grow like weeds, and they're very easy to grow. But you have to do this in a very careful, controlled setting. Highly recommend that we do that kind of work in an FDA-certified center in a facility. And then with that opportunity of having large quantities of stem cells that come from the marrow, the name of those cells is mesenchymal stem cells. They're marrow stromal cells specifically. Those cells can then actually be given to somebody else who has a stroke or traumatic brain injury or another neurological disorder. And that approach has been found to be safe. We've been involved in some of these studies, but there's been many other studies now in the world that have shown that you can give these types of cells, and you don't have to give them any kind of immunosuppressive agents, because the big question is always, am I going to get a rejection? Because this is coming from somebody else. And we know, of course, that in transplantation, if somebody gets an organ that comes from somebody else, they're going to have to be on medications to reduce the chances of having a rejection. Well, what's amazing about this approach is that these cells are so clever at changing the immune responses that you don't actually have to give them any kind of anti-rejection medications. And that's really been, I think, a fundamental revolution in the concept of being able to think about using cell-based therapies. So we can grow these mesenchymal stem cells from the bone marrow, a healthy volunteer, and then they could be used and applied, and patients can be in clinical trials in which these cells are given even with an intravenous administration. And these cells very potently will change the inflammatory responses and the immune responses overall that we see both in our animal models as well as in these early stage clinical trials that we've done overall. There are opportunities that companies that we work with as a university. We have many partnerships with industry, and there are many industry companies that are very interested and are growing a particular type of stem cell and have a intellectual property around a particular cell type that they have worked on, that they've grown out of particular tissues, whether that's bone marrow, or placenta, or umbilical cord. And so the university, we've had opportunity to work with some of those industry companies, and we even have a phase 3 trial for patients with acute stroke that we will know whether this particular cell type coming from this company, Athersys, they are in the lead with regards to doing the most advanced clinical trials for this type of approach, where bone marrow cells are grown from a healthy volunteer, and that approach has been found to be very safe. And we're talking billions of cells being injected into patients with this type of approach. And so in this trial that we're currently doing at UTHealth, patients are being randomized in a definitive efficacy trial. Patients within 18 to 36 hours, because we think that's a time when the inflammatory response is very brisk, and we're enrolling these patients in that time window. They're either getting the cells or they're getting a placebo. And some people may ask, well, a placebo? I don't really want to be in this trial if I'm going to get a placebo. And but the answer to that is we'll never get an answer if these approaches really work for patients. The surest way to be able to know whether something works or not, a new medication, is we have to have randomized placebo-controlled trials. And in this respect, when we think about treatments that are getting approved by the FDA, that is the best and the most strenuous and rigorous way to be able to evaluate whether something works or not. So that trial hopefully will be finished in another year or two, so we'll know whether in that acute setting, whether this type of approach could work for patients with acute stroke. And there are studies going on in traumatic brain injury that we have at UTHealth, and that has been really exciting to us because we're finally going to, I think, have answers. Moving forward, though, what I find really exciting now, though, is that what we've learned is that patients who have an injury from a stroke or traumatic brain injury that go months and even years after the onset of their injury have persistent inflammation. And we know that now, not just from animal studies, but now actually in patients. It's now possible to image persistent inflammation with PET scans. And in that, what we've learned is that it is possible that some people remain disabled because of chronic inflammation in the brain. And many people are aware of the chronic inflammation as a problem they have in their bodies for a number of different reasons, but this is somewhat very new when it comes to brain disorders. And so I was thinking this through and thinking about, is this a new target for patients that are chronically injured? Myself, as well as many other investigators, Dr. Cox in our group, have been really thinking very seriously about, is it possible that chronic inflammation may actually play a role in people's persistent disability? And so because of what we've learned through both scientific studies as well as our own research, we decided, and I decided, to go forward in thinking about the possibility of using these same bone marrow cells for patients with chronic disability. And we have here tonight the Zettners. Scott Zettner, who's in the audience, has had a stroke about 1.5 years ago, and we had a very long conversation with him. Scott, if you want to come up. And this was a very, very detailed, meetings that we had with the Zettners about whether to go forward. Scott having a difficulty being able to move the right side, as well as difficulty speaking. We actually went ahead and did imaging and found that indeed he does have, chronic inflammation in his brain. And we applied to the FDA, and we said, would they consider to approve a one-case scenario where we would give an intravenous infusion of these marrow stromal cells. We went ahead because the FDA gave us that approval. We only work in the setting of getting proper regulatory approvals. That's really important to us overall, because you'll hear lots and lots of stories of people going off to various different clinics, whether that's in the United States or offshore, but that's not what I'm endorsing. I really think that this kind of work has to be done in a very regulated way under proper study. And so we had this, I think this courageous man, came forward, really wanted to think about this, and so we decided to do it, and we brought him into the hospital, and we did an intravenous administration of these cells, and Scott certainly can tell you about, his overall response, in terms of having had that injection and in what we've learned overall.
Okay.
Shall we tell a little bit about that, or maybe wait?
Yeah, let's go ahead and spend a couple of minutes with Mr. Zettner and find out. So Dr. Savitz and his team had administered the stem cell injections, and you had been, how long before that had you had your stroke?
2 years. 2 years.
So you were 2 years out
Yeah.
before this treatment even began.
Yeah.
And how long did it take for you to feel some improvement?
3 or 4 months. 3 or
Wow.
4 months. What had happened? It happened because it happened into more. They. It
It's okay,
happened-
take your time. It's hard for any of us to stand there with the
Yeah.
microphone in your face.
What had happened for stem cell is it took a long time to get good, but without stem cell, it came expeditiously. 3 or 4 months was the case, where 4 or 5 years.
Amazing.
Yeah.
So,
That's amazing.
so we're, and again, we thought this would be something safe to do, because we've learned a lot about the safety of the approach. What we wanted to see was, could this help?
Yeah.
Overall, and because Scott, as Mr. Zettner, has had a lot of difficulty speaking, really a lot, and the speaking now is a lot better.
Yeah.
And the opportunity that we didn't know about was, in even thinking about his speaking, we were wondering about his arm overall, and whether he could do that, which has been amazing, to see that he can lift up the arm like this. I mean, this is the kind of situation where he couldn't do that before. And, what we didn't, though, realize was that this could actually help his speaking as well.
Yeah.
And I think that was something so we've been learning a lot, about this. And I know that the crowd has questions about it, which we'll see how Karen's, we answer to Karen.
We've got the clock ticking. So,
Yeah.
but I did want to ask one question. So the standard wisdom has always been that after X length of time following an ischemic stroke, the standard wisdom was 30 days, 6 months, and that's basically going to be where the patient is able to get to, regardless of how much therapy, et cetera. So from both of you, what I'm hearing you say is this has exceeded that because there was a 2-year post-dromal, is that such a word? A 2-year time when you had reached the point that was as good as it was going to get. So this was taking it a step further.
It was just going fine. Slow as you will. But once the stem cell, it's like at 4 to 6 months.
Incredible.
But it was slow in process. I'm a stroke survivor, and I'm 62 years old, and I March the 27th, 2017, had here. That was my stroke.
Got it. Well, congratulations to both of you. I mean, to Mr. and Mrs. Zettner, and certainly to Dr. Savitz. So, okay, let me go ahead and thank you. And I'm sure people will have questions for you, sir, after this event. Let me start with the Q&A portion. So we've had several people write in regarding exactly what you mentioned, the cord blood registry. And all of us who are grandparents, much less parents, this is like science fiction for us, that our grandchildren have this treasure that hopefully the future could possibly keep them safe. But this also begs the question, can it be donated? Can my daughter donate her children's cord blood or a portion of it if it is not needed, or so that's available, right?
Yep, so that's a great question. It's a wonderful one that people are asking. It also indicates, I think, society and people wanting to come together to help other people. And I think that's what's wonderful, overall about these potential opportunities in our future. So when we first started thinking about the use of umbilical cord cells, it was really all around that if there was a problem that happened later in life in that child's life, that those cells would be available. And I myself, I didn't have that opportunity for my 14-year-old daughter, but we did for our 10-year-old. And of course, we went ahead and definitely did actually request to store the cells. But the question is really, would there be this opportunity maybe to donate and use those cells for somebody else? And the answer to that question is yes. I do believe that our future will actually move more in the direction that there are certain cells within the umbilical cord and placenta tissues that could actually be used and could be manufactured to an extent that they could be used as a source of a potential therapeutic in the future for other people. But what's important to know about this is that we're not there yet, that we need clinical trials properly designed to be able to know whether they could actually help other people. That's really the only way we're ever going to make progress, is we have to be able to do these clinical studies. But at least from what I have learned, it looks like certain cell types, not all of them, could potentially work the way these bone marrow cells are working and not be rejected in a way that it could be harmful to somebody else.
And that brings up another question, which we've gotten several from this as well. Many people have had quote-unquote stem cell therapies, as you alluded to, either in other countries and many of them here, right here. And I just got a question from a young woman who said she had stem cell therapies done on her arm There was some resultant paralysis post a break, I believe. She said it was completely ineffective. Was it a sham? And of course, we don't know. But can you talk a little bit about the billboards we see and or just word from our neighbors that say they are going out of the country for a stem cell treatment on their lower lumbar or their back for chronic pain? Can you speak to those a bit?
I can. I can speak to it. So, I fully appreciate that people who have gone through the health system and they've tried, and they feel that the problems that they have persisted despite going to physicians and doctors, or they feel they have conditions that are so intractable and there's nothing, that's available to patients overall. And so I can understand the motivation, and I can appreciate that very much, that if there's another opportunity out there that they see that's being advertised, that they might want to take a look at that possibility. I mean, I think, the problem with that is that this is such an experimental and innovative area that it takes time for us to be able to learn the science behind the approaches. And that, everything that we have out there that's available to us, everything comes with risk, in our lives. And so what's troublesome to me overall is that if people see an advertisement to go to a clinic to get injected with stem cells, I would really want to know everything I could, about what that is. If people are thinking about getting injected, we have to first state the obvious, which is that none of this is FDA approved. And so that may mean certain things to certain people, but it's important just to keep that first part in mind, that the only way to get FDA approval is to go through the rigorous process of having treatments undergo rigorous clinical trials. And that's done by investigators across the world overall to get to those answers. Patients that don't want to wait, on the other hand, I can understand that. They're not, it takes a long time for new treatments to come through. But the risk is there, and it's real. We have seen more and more articles that have come out in the literature that indicate people are getting harmed when they go and get injected with stem cells from a company that's offering that for a fee-for-service type of arrangement. People have been harmed in many different ways, and we're learning that and seeing that as time goes on. And it is really important to understand what are the cells. Many of these cells may actually be highly dividing and proliferative cells that could turn into tumors. For example, we've seen that actually in certain people, not in the United States, but in other countries, that has happened. And so, for me, it would be really a question of, okay, what exactly am I being injected with? We have learned that people think they're being injected with one thing, and it turns out it was something else. There were no cells that were injected, or the cells turned out to be something completely different than what they were told overall. For something so innovative and experimental, one would want to see data, that was properly collected to know that the approach that's being taken in terms of what they're being injected with is leading to safety and is leading to better outcomes. Of course, I'm going to say that as a scientist overall. I think that's what's really important here. So I would be really careful, about what's being peddled, what's being advertised, both in the U.S. And in the world. There's real potential for harm from some of these approaches.
Okay,
and
thank you.
At the very least, please look up and see whether is it a study that maybe is going on that's registered by clinicaltrials.gov. That's at least the bare minimum that I would want to know, that if you're going to go to some place that's offering something like this, are they part of a trial, that's been FDA approved? I think that would be really important.
Thank you. Again, several questions on, is there a future for stem cell therapies with traumatic brain injuries such as a car wreck? Is there a future for degenerative diseases such as Alzheimer's, Parkinson's? Do you see a strong future for that?
Absolutely. The answer to that is clearly yes at this point. I think there is a great future for the potential application of stem cells for all of the items that were just mentioned. For patients that have had a traumatic brain injury, we have very active work going on right now at our university, and that work is actually entailing looking at the patient's own bone marrow cells. There is really intriguing work that has already been completed with the healthy bone marrow cell type that I mentioned in patients with Parkinson's disease. Dr. Sheese down at our university has already completed a phase 1 safety study, and there's already signals from those studies that indicate that it's possible these cells could slow down the neurodegenerative disease process in Parkinson's, which makes me think that this could certainly be applied for patients with Alzheimer's disease. And so I would make a prediction that we will see more and more regenerative cell therapies that are going to be looked at for a whole range of neurological disorders that's going to come in time. The only limiting factor, quite honestly, that I see is funding. That we have to be able to find the funding to be able to do the right studies with the small number of patients as needed, the minimum number, the most efficiently designed studies to actually get them done quickly to be able to get answers on the full therapeutic potential, for these various different disorders.
Great. We're going to take about 2 more questions. One I wanted to ask was not necessarily asked by someone else, but cells divide and multiply, divide and multiply, divide and multiply, but there is a natural cell death there's an end point. So are these procedures something that have to be, as you said, they grow like weeds, but I don't know how long they live. Yeah. So is this do you foresee these procedures as ones that will be repeated, like several rounds of it?
Yes.
Okay.
The answer is yes. So the really another interesting aspect that Karen's bringing up from the questions that are being raised is, when these cells are injected in the body, they don't last very long. They actually don't persist. They die. And that's been somewhat of a bummer for many people to hear that. But actually, I'm actually relieved, in many ways, because they're basically doing their job. They are going to areas of injury, or they're attracted to areas of inflammation. They're releasing factors that are changing the environment of the injury to allow for repair. And that's it. They die. So they do their job. And what's really amazing about this is the cells, and I swear there's an intelligence to this, that the cells, we've seen this, in our work, know the environment that they're in and release certain types of biological factors to change that environment selectively. And so it's really interesting in terms of how these cells work. And so then to answer the rest of the question that came from Karen, these cells don't appear, the ones I'm speaking about are these bone marrow cells. They don't appear really to proliferate, and they just die off. So then the question becomes, okay, if we see an effect, and this is something the Zettners have already asked me, which is, can I get another infusion? Well, that's the next step, I think, for all of us here, which is most likely one injection may get us a certain distance into what we're doing. But then it begs the question of a serial injection approach, multiple injections. And so that is where the field is now heading, particularly for conditions like neurodegenerative disorders, Parkinson's disease. That's actually the next grant application that my colleague Dr. Sheese has submitted to the NIH, which is to say, we need to figure this out. How many injections are going to be the most effective? And over what time period are we talking about? So I would predict that when it comes to patients with chronic disability, that probably we are going to be looking at now studies of multiple injections. And we're only at the beginning of that story.
Wonderful. The last, this is not a question, it's a request. For those of us who do not know necessarily how to troll the medical literature, et cetera, where should people look, and to whom? I'm assuming their primary care provider is I would hope at least a good yay or nay if they're looking into this, or at least a place to start. But where online? You said clinicaltrials.gov, correct, is a place to start searching. Yep. To see if something is up there. Where else can the lay public take a look?
Well, I definitely would agree. I think you should start there at least, in looking at clinicaltrials.gov, so you can see whether the study's been registered. And, that means at least that it's gone through a certain amount of regulatory approval. That's not enough, though. It is possible for still there to be the possibilities that this study may not be as regulated as you wish. And so I also think that it's good to look at other websites. There is, for instance, the International Society for Stem Cell Research, ISSCR. They're very rigorous. These are very rigorous scientists. I think that they've posted a lot of information that's helpful to know about what is considered to be kind of on the stage for proper testing, and things that they feel are definitely not. But I do think that kind of professional society is where you might want to look for additional information. At UTHealth, we're actually building our websites to actually talk about studies that we think are really could have a lot of high impact, for patients with brain disorders. So I definitely would look into those types of sources.
Dr. Savitz, thank you for giving us a much-needed overview of a complicated but very exciting area of medical science that could reimagine life for stroke patients and for patients who are suffering from other traumatic brain injuries, maladies, or conditions. And particularly for separating fact from fiction. Because this way we now know what is what is legitimately in the present and what is legitimately the hope of the future. And I would love to thank ABC 13 always for giving us this incredible platform to inspire our Houston community to lead healthier lives. I'd also like to extend our gratitude to UT physicians, our partners in health. Thank you very much. Thank you back there from McGovern Medical School, who teach, train, treat, and provide the highest quality care for our families. If you need more information on UT Physicians, utphysicians.com. Tonight was the 5th UT Health House Call for 2019. It is such an honor always to partner with an organization that really walks the walk and talks the talk when it comes to safety and the health of their community, whether it's the safety engineering of their cars or whether it is the health information that they impart to the community. So I want to thank Joe Drago and Mercedes-Benz of the Woodlands once again. Our next UT Health House Call will be October 10th at 6:30. On abc13.com, and the topic will be influenza and your heart. To view tonight's program, please visit abc13.com under the promotion section, and you can find the entire broadcast there. And also, if you are tuning in next month, we do hope that you will have had your flu shot by the time you pull this up. Thank you all, and we so hope to see you next time. Thank you again, Dr. Savitz, and thank you, Zettners, for coming all the way from San Antonio to be here tonight. Please enjoy the refreshments that are available to you.